I know all the time. Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Through the microphone? Okay, great. First, let's all just thank Ashley in the back setting us up for bringing us indoors. I left all my outer gear in my car because I was ready, right? So thank you for coming out tonight for the second in the series of the wisdom of trees rooted in science. I'm with the College of Science. My name is Erin Deely. I'm the Director of Recruitment and Engagement. So my whole goal is to bring in the next gen scientists. And then one of our fabulous community outreach efforts is to bring researchers into the community with partners like Tucson Botanical Gardens. So just to reiterate, this is a genuine partnership, no money exchange. We're just sharing space and resources and fabulous speakers that want to share their passion for their research, and then the community like you that are interested in hearing about these kinds of things. So thank you again. This will be the second in a series of 5 talks. We're also in partnership with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Science. Has anyone visited the facility and done okay, great. I will mention on the back table when you head out tonight, I have several brochures of the various research and public facilities that the College of Science manages. So Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, internationally recognized, fantastic. Also, if you haven't been to the Mirror Lab, anybody been to the Mirror Lab? They make the world's largest mirrors, in the basement of the football stadium. Best thing happening in the football stadium, in my opinion. A lot longer than, right? Because we're science geeks. I do love to throw out a statistic because I do recruitment. Just to remind everyone about this jewel in the desert. How many of you like U of A sports? I do. I enjoy it. So we know that a lot of attention is often given to athletics. But I'll just mention, in the College of Science alone, we raise more research dollars than all of our athletic programs combined. Wow. So we're a science school. I'm not going to lie, the astronomy department takes a big chunk. It takes a bit of cash to get out to space, right? So, but that being said, it's distributed beautifully across all of the disciplines within the College of Science. So, and in addition to that, how many of you visited the Festival of Books? Yeah, it's massive on campus. We're now the 3rd largest festival of books in the country, and the only one was STEM outreach, so STEM literacy, STEM education. So I'm with the College of Science, and we host that along with Bio 5, and we have probably 30,000 visitors in 2 days. So just so you know, I have a flyer on the back table also for Science City. It's well known for the hands-on activities for families. It's 10 tents with 90 booths, right? With hands like DNA extraction, touching a cockroach. You could do anything you want to, basically, which is fantastic. Yeah, but I do want to mention, don't overlook, because an adult audience may enjoy all of that with their families and friends, but also we have a science cafe tent. So we also have researchers across disciplines in STEM giving public talks like this both days, all day. You can go on the website and see that schedule. We also have the largest number of nationally recognized current authors in the Science City. So there are 400 authors that come to that festival, and the most expensive, meaning the ones that are right now are selling and hot, we have more science authors than ever this year. So the main stage, or the science stage, all day, both days, with panels and nationally recognized authors. Of course, we'll pair in local authors and faculty that may, go along with those themes. So don't overlook that. That's March 2nd and 3rd. It's coming up, and it goes on rain or shine, just so you know. And I'll just mention Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, the Mirror Lab, and there are 9 open houses, but those tours are free and open to the public. So it's busy, it's crazy. There's some competition for those free tickets, but Flandreau Science Center is also free and open to the public that both all weekend. And the dome shows, if you haven't been into the new 3D dome projection where the planetarium shows are, we also have IMAX quality movies in there. So they're opening a new exhibit. It's I'm gonna butcher the name, but I love sharks. It's a new shark exhibit, and it's the mystery and myths of the misunderstood shark, right? And they're going to have life-size replicas of dorsal fins and tails. But for me, because I'm a desert rat that loves the ocean, there is a documentary of free divers that research great whites. So imagine that on that dome. So check it out. And anyway, enough about pitching Science City, but I can't overstate what a great community event it is. Right. And in addition to that, I have evaluation forms. So if you would, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. We share those results with our speakers. They're always wanting to better their game. And then also we use that demographic information to justify being here. So the more of you that fill that out, the better that we can continue this program. Also at the very bottom, where your list, if you want to get announcements about not just this series, the Tucson Botanical Garden Science Cafe is one of 5. So I mentioned last week that we had some typos in the brochure. I have the new, correct, full complement of all 5 venues, their themes, talks, dates, titles. And I will remind you, I do have Facebook Live going tonight. Most of our venues do simulcast their talks. They're in the moment, they're not polished. But you can also access these talks on our Science Cafe website, and there's a link as well in the brochure and on the website to go to our YouTube channel. So you can see all venues anytime we've ever collected these videos. So this is about 1.5 years that we've finally figured out we could do live. And just to give you a taste, we had 45 people in our audience last week. We had 52 watching. So it does double and triple our audience. Yeah. See? That's why we're doing it. We're in the new century. Anyway, quite a ways into it, actually. So backing back up, I know Ashley's trying to seat everybody. Ashley, did you have anything you want to share about TBG, or I didn't mean to call you out?
No, that's okay. Thank you all for being here tonight and coming out, even though you thought it would be freezing cold. Yeah, that shows that you were all really tough. So the only thing that I'll point out is the art exhibits that we have at the garden tonight. I hope that you'll take a few minutes to enjoy. Out of the Woods is surrounding us, and also in the Legacy Gallery on the other side of the gift shop. This is all artwork done by artists from the American Society of Botanical Artists. They're all portraits of trees in public gardens and arboretum across the nation. So they're really special. And tonight and for the rest of spring, we're here to celebrate trees.
Yeah. I believe we have a docent in the audience, and actually, after the talk tonight, if you like your hand stamped, you can certainly.
No, they don't do that because we're already in.
We're already in the garden.
Yeah,
okay,
you're all set.
So when we return to the Saba Pavilion, which is the outdoor venue, just know after our talks, courtesy of Tucson Botanical Gardens, you get your hand stamped and you can stroll the gardens and all the exhibits. So that's a fabulous perk to fabulous talk. And I'll just explain, if you haven't been to one of these before, the format is I do all of this fabulous, we're the College of Science, and aren't we amazing, and would you like to be involved more? And resources on the back table. Oh, I wanted to finish up with, if you give us your contact information, I want to assure everyone that is simply to give you notice of upcoming talks of all the science cafes. And if you're not familiar with our science lecture series, it's fabulous right now, Searching for Certainty. We are in an age where people are questioning and doubting science, which is somewhat tragic because it's fueled our innovation and our place in the world. And what's really great is this series is 6 women that are pioneers in their fields. So you'll get perspectives from different science STEM disciplines. So there's a nice postcard back there that lists the talks, the themes, and tomorrow night is one. No, what am I saying? Tuesday. These weeks are long. My apologies.
Today's Monday,
right? And I should mention, much like this, in a much more polished format, we partner with Arizona Public Media, and they film those talks. So we have 14 years of podcasts that include video. So you can go to the most recent series or any of those in the past, and they're all pretty still current as far as information goes. All right, well, we'll have our presentation, and then I know we're in a little bit of cramped space, so we're going to keep Kevin kind of trapped up here so he won't get to stroll as much. Once he has the opportunity to give his presentation, we'll have a Q&A, so we would love to hear from you. I'll moderate that a little bit if it gets a long. And it's great to have and entertain questions. And then, depending on how late it is, you can come up and have one-on-one questions. So, and also I wanted to reiterate the Laboratory of True Ring Research brochure is on the back table. If you don't go to Science City, they still offer public tours for free all year. So you want to get in contact with them and learn about those opportunities. So, are we ready? Yeah. A while ago, right? Well, let me introduce our speaker, Kevin, and is it Anchukaitis?
Perfect.
God. He received his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, a master's from the University of Tennessee, and his PhD from the University of Arizona. Woohoo! Go alums. Oh, can I ask just by show of hands how many U of A alums we have in the audience? Let me get count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you would, I brought 30 evaluations. If you identify yourself as an alum and if you'd like to learn about alum activities within the College of Science or campus-wide, we have a new alumni manager that would be happy to just send you information about that. So just identify yourself. There is a box that says alum, and then we'll get in touch with you with your email. Okay, backing back up. Again, yes. The main reason you're here. Before returning to the University of Arizona as an associate professor in Earth Systems Geography in 2015, he was a postdoctoral fellow and assistant research professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He once blogged for the New York Times. I did ask for some personal information so you can get to know the scientist behind the science. And he has the blog address here, so I'll leave that on the back table if anybody wants to check his work out. Science Magazine once said of him that few paleoclimatologists are worldlier than Kevin. I said that. Wow. His hobbies are hiking, backpacking, camping, cooking, wine, and hanging out with their dog, Xavier. No, Javier. Yes, Javier. So it's Javier, named after the mission, Son of Javier, Del Bac. And he rode lightweight crew at Georgetown University, and his last name is Lithuanian. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce, please welcome Kevin. And his talk is titled Unique Trees Tell the Stories of Past Civilizations.
Thanks all for being here. Let me ask, would it be okay if I didn't use the mic? Is it going to bother you? You can hear me? Okay. All right. And I'll now obscure people less. So thank you for being here. This is really fantastic. And even more so to be amongst the exhibit that is the reason we're here. So thanks to the College of Science, thanks to Tucson Botanical Gardens. This is really an amazing opportunity, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm going to talk today about two different areas of research that we've been working on. And to introduce this a little bit, this is a photo of Yasha. It's in Guatemala. And when we think about the connection between sort of climate change, climate variability in the past, and changes in civilization, be it collapse, demise, or even the rise of civilizations, the Maya are some of the ones we sort of immediately come to mind. And I think it's really sort of a natural human condition to see the remains of these civilizations that have come before us and to wonder what happened. What was it that occurred that changed their civilization so fundamentally? And perhaps one of the reasons we ask that is we're curious about what might happen to our own. So now the Maya are an interesting case because in the event of their collapse also lies one of the mysteries. So the Maya were prolific in writing in their glyph language, in the language that they had, the dates that different cities were built, moments of auspicious occasions within the Maya civilization, and yet the collapse of the ancient Maya, or the classic Maya, is characterized by the slow decline and eventual disappearance of this writing, of this recording of history, of recording these unique moments. And so we're left at the moment where we want to know what happened with this lacuna, with this gap in our knowledge about what it was that transpired to result in such massive changes in such a long-spanning and really, for the time, technically adept empire. So if we want to try and answer this question, we're forced to look for something besides the written record. So in the Yucatan, where there are not a lot of trees we can use, and tonight I'll talk mostly about how we can use trees to understand climate and past civilization. People have gone to lakes, and so this is just one record from a lake in the Yucatan Peninsula in the midst of the Maya civilization. It's a measure of sulfur, and so down is both more sulfur and drier conditions. And you see as you come into this period of what's sort of known as the classic Maya collapse, starting in the late 600s and through the 900s AD, that this is the moment that in these lake sediments, all this sulfur appears in the form of gypsum. We know that in these lakes, gypsum forms because it's really dry, the lake is really low, temperatures are really high, there's not much precipitation. And so even though this is sort of a low resolution record, it's far from the kind of written record we want to say that was something like, it got really dry, the maize harvest failed, the civilization in our city collapsed. We can start to sort of make inferences about what some kind of connections might have existed between climate change, climate variability, and changes in civilization. Now, right in our backyard, we're familiar with an example of this as well. These are reconstructions of drought. In this case, I'll talk a little bit more about these units of drought. In the warm red colors, it's indicating really severe droughts. Blues are indicating wetter than normal conditions. And this is actually averaged over a period of 22 years in the late 13th century. And so what you're looking at is a massive, widespread drought covering the Four Corners region, coming into our region here. There's almost nothing like it on record. Even the present drought that we're in has only gone on for 17 years. Give this talk in a couple of years, we can update that and see what happens. But we know that this event was accompanied by major changes in the ancestral Pueblo people of the Four Corners region. Once again, though, we're left with this lacuna, we're left with this gap in our knowledge. There's no writing about what happened. There's no record of the failure of maize harvest. There's no record of the consequences of drought. But what we know from the material culture is people left the Four Corners and they came to be elsewhere in our region. But why? What was it that caused this? How much of this was climate? How much of this was secondary effects or indirect effects of this large drought? We're searching for these answers and they weren't written down. So what do we do? Well, what I want to talk about today is that while there may be no ancient weather stations, while there may be no records of the climate that led to these events, of the consequences of climate variability for these really advanced civilizations, something that was there were these trees. You're actually looking at what we believe, at least up until recently, was the oldest tree in the Himalaya. This is from Nepal. It requires an 11-day hike to get there, and it has an inner date that is at least 900 AD. So this tree is over 1,000 years old, and probably longer. It wasn't possible to actually get to the very center of the tree. So trees standing on the landscape have been there. Some of them have been there for a millennium or more. And so they have been witnesses to these climate changes. They've been witnesses to these civilization changes. And if we can learn to ask them what they saw, what they recorded, what they locked up in their annual rings, then we can start to decipher what might have happened to these different civilizations that have come and gone over the last 2,000 years, over the Common Era. How do you ask a tree something? So if you saw Don last week, he probably described one way in which this can be done. We really love trees, and so we don't cut down trees, we don't want to damage trees, but what we can do is something akin to taking a bit of a biopsy. So this is an increment borer. It's got three parts. It's got a handle. This is the business end. So the tip of this is very sharp. It has both a sharp cutting tip at the very edge, and then has these sort of screw or screwdriver-like pieces that are also very sharp, and it's hollow. And so what you do is attach this to the handle, and you can wind this into the tree. And so the tree stays still, this winds in usually. It's really, really hard for them to get away. This winds into the tree, and meanwhile, a piece of that wood is entering into the barrel, and then using this spoon, we can fish it out. And as I'll show you in a moment, this looks like maybe the size of a pencil, probably thinner, more like a chopstick. And from the point of view of the tree, it's like as if you had gotten a paper cut. The living part of the tree is barely receiving a scratch. This is what it looks like when you pull one out. You can see my dirty fingers here. Even now, before we've even put a nice surface on it, you can see that these patterns of rings, there's some very narrow here, some very wide here. And so we're going to use that information that's captured, that's recorded, that is fixed within these rings, these annual rings of trees, to decipher what climate was like back when this tree was growing. Now we do this many times. So at least 2 cores per tree, at least 20 trees per site, more often 40 or 60 trees per site. And then in a moment, I'm going to show you some of the 400 sites we have covering Asia that allows us to reconstruct climate in the past. But we come back to the laboratory of tree ring research here at the University of Arizona. We lay these cores into these wooden mounts, and we put a surface on them so we can see the rings, we can see the cellular structure of the rings. We then assign a date. Oops, no, let's not do that, Kevin. Let's assign a date, and we exactly and precisely date every single one of those rings so we know that the year that they formed. Now this is important because we want to be able to go back and say what happened in the year 1327 AD in Southeast Asia. We want to be able to know precisely to the year how climate varied, because we want to connect this information to the human record, to the lifetime of a generation, or the span of an empire. And to do that, we really need this very precise annual chronology. We can then measure all of these rings. I see some graduate students in the audience. You'll measure thousands, tens of thousands of rings in your career. Saw a look of horror from that. And then we can take those measurements of annual rings, precisely dated to the year that they formed, combine them all across a site to get a sort of an average growth. And then what we do is we take that average growth year by year, and using statistical models, we can convert things like the width of an annual ring to a measure of, say, the amount of precipitation. And we go year by year, and we can estimate how much precipitation fell in that location in that region. And this provides us with an incredibly powerful way to understand how climate changed in the past, varied in the past, on the same kind of order as the information we get from a rain gauge or a thermometer. In the same units. We don't even have to make any inference. We can talk about the same kind of units you would get from the weather report. So one tree is good. Lots of trees are better. Lots of sites made of many trees are even better. So what you're looking at here is a network of over 400 tree ring sites. Each one of these dots represents a place where we've gone, usually many of us. That tree that from Nepal is one of these red dots right here, in that one of those red dots from here. And each one of these represents dozens or scores of trees that have been combined to make what we call a tree ring chronology, an estimate of how much trees at that site grew over time, and we can use that time series of growth to reconstruct past climates. And so I'm going to actually show you some ways that we've done this, the way we approach this problem. Now, if we have this network of sites, we can actually not just reconstruct climate at a point, we can reconstruct climate over space. We can actually come up with maps, weather maps, if you will, from times before we had actual instrumental observations. This is how we do it. So here's a map of the Northern Hemisphere. You see all these little crosses, and these are all places where we would like to estimate past climate. We then have a network. This is a cartoon network. It doesn't represent all the hundreds, actually thousands of chronologies we have. We have a network that's spread over space, and what we do is we go point by point, and so we'll start with this point right here. We look in the neighborhood of that point, so maybe a few hundred kilometers, and look for the trees that are closest to that point, and then we use those trees that are in that neighborhood to estimate past climate on an annual basis at that point. And then we do it again, and then we do it again. And so we do this hundreds of times, going point by point until we've built up an estimate of annual climate, in this case rainfall or drought, at each one of these points. And what that means is then we can make maps. We can actually make ancient weather maps. Now, most of the data I'm going to show you today is not in precipitation or temperature. It's in this unit we call the Polymer Drought Severity Index, or PDSI. It reflects the combination of rainfall that comes into a soil, the amount of moisture that is then lost due to evaporation, and it accounts for the fact that water sticks around in the soil for a while. And we use this metric because it more accurately reflects the kind of soil moisture that affects things like agriculture. And it also, as a consequence, reflects really what trees sense most directly, which is the quantity of soil moisture. So when you see negative values, these mean that there's dry conditions. Sort of dry would be like a -1. Starting to get really dry is a -2. Really epically, seriously, intensely dry is -3. Wetter conditions, which are going to also be important in one of our stories, one of our studies here, are positive values. So +1 is pretty wet, +2 is starting to get really wet, +3 is sort of epically wet conditions. So when you see these numbers, keep this in mind, that negative means dry, positive means wet. What's so cool about this approach to reconstructing climate from tree rings, not only on an annual basis, but also in space, is we get these maps. So this is just a snapshot of the kind of information that we can reconstruct. So this goes from 1760 through 1767. You're looking at Asia here, so here's Lake Baikal, here's India and Southeast Asia. You can see Japan and Sakhalin, up here Korea, China and the Tibetan Plateau. And what's great about this is we can go year by year and see not only the patterns in time of drought or wet conditions, but also how they vary in space. So here, for instance, you see that 2 fairly wet years in Southeast Asia were followed by sort of a normal, maybe even slightly wet, before going into drought conditions again for another 3 years. So we can start to see these climate features, climate variability in space. And this is going to be really important if we want to connect our climate reconstructions from tree rings back to the human record, back to the archaeological record, back to the historical record. So I want to tell 2 stories today. And the first story is about the rise of an empire. And we're going to go here to central northwest Mongolia, and we're going to talk about the Mongol Empire of the 13th century. Really, truly one of the most remarkable rapid rises of a nomadic empire. They spread out to conquer much of Asia and Europe in a very short time. And there have always been questions about how this came to be and whether there was any environmental influence at all, or is this just the inspiration of a really talented and gregarious leader, Genghis Khan? So to zoom in a little bit, Lake Baikal is up here. Hoshkol, this is the lake, so we're still in Mongolia, but the border with modern-day Russia is right here, and then over here are the lakes of western Mongolia. And we're actually going to be right in this region here, south of Hoshkol, which is called the Orhan River Valley. And this is a particularly important site. It has been basically the center or capital of 2 major empires, including the empire of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. His capital was here, Haharin. You can still go and visit the ruins of Haharin. So we've been working, Amy Hessel, myself, Neil Peterson at Harvard University, have been working in this region now for 6 or 7 years, trying to understand the history of drought in this region, both because we want to understand how past droughts may have influenced the rise and history of these empires, but also because we're concerned about what is going to happen in the future in Mongolia. How will climate change in the future affect the climate and therefore the livelihoods and the well-being and the vulnerability of people that still carry out nomadic practices in this region? Now, for those of you not familiar with the Mongol Empire, this is a really remarkable empire. It arises out of this region, so just to the south of Lake Baikal, here's Haharin, which eventually became the capital of Genghis Khan's empire. Genghis Khan himself is believed to have been born in this region just to the northeast of that. And when Genghis Khan was coming of age in the early 12th century, this was a time of a lot of strife, a lot of small groups battling each other. Then by the early 1200s, under the command of Genghis Khan, these groups united and spread out to essentially conquer much of Asia. Originally, there were a few short excursions by the 1210s and 1220s. Massive horseback armies on horseback actually had spread into Eastern Europe and were handily conquering Russian and other groups that were here. a really amazing rise to power to conquer such a large land mass. The question is, how do you do this? How do you do this if you are a nomadic pastoral society? What is it that leads you to depart from your home territory, your homeland, and spread out all of Asia, across all of Asia, to conquer much of the known world at that time? And so this is where I like to pause for a moment, and we get to think a little bit about being historians. And so I want to take a poll, because I want us to think about what do we think is most likely to have, if there was a climate cause, inspired or caused or pushed or pulled the Mongols to leave their nomadic homeland and spread out to conquer Asia. So 2 ideas you can find out there in the academic literature. One is this idea of climate or environmental change pushing people out of a region. So in this case, imagine you're living on the steppe, you're a nomadic pastoral society that depends on the rains that come to drive the growth of the grass, which allows you to feed your sheep and your cows, and your horses in particular, your horses. If it gets dry, what do? Do you spread out to try and find better land, to find better resources? Perfectly reasonable idea, right? The second idea that's out there is that maybe it's a pull, if you will. Maybe things are so good at home. Maybe the grassland is lush. Maybe the grass is up to here. You've got twice as many horses as you ever did. The pastoral lifestyle is a good one. And with the right charismatic leader, you have the ability to build an army that is able to extend itself all the way across Asia. We call this the pull condition because things aren't bad at home, but there's that temptation to, for whatever reason, spread out and conquer the known world. So I want to poll us right now and see what people think is the most likely. So who votes for it being some kind of climate push that caused the Mongols to spread out and conquer Asia? Hold them high, own it. So maybe a little less than half. All right. Who believes it could be the pull? All right, maybe a little more than half, but you know, we've got a split. And indeed, this kind of split that's present right now in this room has been present in the historical literature for a long time. So, Arnold Toynbee, one of the preeminent historians of the 20th century, wrote like a 14-volume book called The Study of History, all of it. This is from page 170 of one of the volumes. This is insane. Right? But very eloquently, right? Talking about, okay, when desiccation reaches a degree on which the steppe of Asia, where the Mongols lived, can no longer provide pasture for the quantity of cattle for which the nomads have stocked it, they swerve from their beaten track of their annual migration, invade the surrounding cultivated countries, right? The Mongol hordes, the barbarians coming down and raiding the poor farmers, middle of the 20th century. On the other hand, when climate swings back and humidity attains a point where the steppe is capable of roots and cereals, the peasant makes his counteroffensive. So the farmers come in and raid the barbarians. So this is an idea that is ingrained in the very core of history, world history, in Toynbee. And it persists. So has anyone read any of Brian Fagan's books? He's a popular archaeologist, anthropologist. He's written about, this one is about the medieval warm period. He wrote a book about the Little Ice Age. And so when he's talking here about the 12th and 13th centuries, he says basically the same thing, that Genghis Khan and his empire rose to power at a time when drier conditions shrank pasturage on the steppe. Sounds kind of familiar. But the same idea, right? That a brilliant leader succeeded in taking these armies from this region that was suffering under drought and desiccation and spread out into the lush world of the rest of Asia and especially Eastern Europe. The flail of God, Genghis Khan, shook Asia and Europe to its foundation. So this idea of the push is really well embedded in world history. Okay, So welcome to North Central Mongolia. We were really interested in examining this question because this was something that has come up over and over again, this idea that people leave the steppe because it's dry and they're suffering from a drought. And yet we didn't have this information. We had no information to support this. What little information people had drawn on had come from as far away as the Caspian Sea, nowhere in the neighborhood of the Orhan River Valley. And there's no trees for most of this. You see the problem. The Orhan River Valley and the steppe, right, the grassy steppe, is not necessarily known for its long-lived trees that are going to take us back to the 13th century. So we had to come up with and discover a very special place, and that very special place is sort of lurking in the corner of this photo in our Soviet era vans over here, which are just as scary as you might imagine. Something's going to look different to you here, and I'll show you what you're looking at here that's so different, but something changes, right? You go from this smooth, it almost looks like it's been sort of mowed, and that's the sheep doing that, right? And then something's different over here. Obviously there's trees, but you can sense in the texture of this that there's something different about this landscape just over here that we're surveying. And what you're seeing is a lava flow. The cinder cones here, if you've ever been up to the San Francisco Peaks, if you've ever been up near Flagstaff and you've seen those cinder cones, not a dissimilar type of environment. Here's where this lava oozed out, we think about 9,000 years ago, so it's really young volcanism. And as a consequence, this lava flow that oozed out of this volcano here, it actually blocked this river and created this, what they call the White Lake. So this translates as the White Lake. So this is a very different environment than the grassland that surrounds it. Here we are on top of it. So this is Amy Hessel and Osana, our colleague. And you can see that they're on this sort of peninsula of lava, and all of this is the lava flow. You can actually see one of the cinder cones over here. And growing here, but nowhere else, are these trees growing on this lava field. It's a brilliant, beautiful sight. Here's another view of it. So much of your day working on this lava field is making sure you don't break your ankle by getting trapped in a bit of lava. The stuff is young, it's big pieces, it's big boulders. You're carrying a chainsaw, you're trying to hop around, you're tired. So you spend a lot of days just walking around looking for trees. And you're like, well, I can see trees. So we're after the old ones because we want to get back into the 1200s. In fact, we want to go back even farther. So the old living trees on the site look like this. Beautiful. If you've ever seen the bristle cones up in the White Mountains, not dissimilar, right? So there's part of the stem that's dead. It's sort of twisted. It's kind of like the top is broken off. It's suffering, right? Why is it suffering? Because it's growing on this incredibly well-drained lava. So what little moisture you do get into the steppe that falls at this site, that water percolates very quickly through this rocky, broken-up landscape. And so these trees are just grabbing for whatever water they can get. They're living a hard life, but because they're living a hard life, they're living an old life. So some of these living trees can be as old as 800 years. This is larch and pine. Now that's not going to get us back far enough. 800 years is great, but we need to go back before the time of Genghis Khan. What's really unique about this site is this. This is a standing dead snag right here. And this is Osana taking a chainsaw to it. What we do is we take the chainsaw and we cut little wedge pieces. Looks like a piece of pie or a corner of a cookie. And what's amazing about these is some of these have been standing dead on the landscape for hundreds and hundreds of years. This tree died over 400 years ago and is still standing there. It's dry enough, it didn't fall over, and it's so hard to access this site that people haven't come and taken it for firewood. So this gets us back a little bit further. And then here's the real prizes. Laying on the ground where something like this has finally fallen, we can take the chainsaw and take pieces out of this. Some of these go back to before the year 1 AD. They go back into BCE. I just like this picture because Carrie looks like a badass. She's got the chainsaw chaff, she's got the sunglasses, and she's cutting this piece of wood that is well over 1,300 years old. So what do we do? Well, we've got these living trees, and they go back several hundred years. We've got the standing snags. Here's another beautiful one. Look at this. There's Osana again. This is just glorious. It's absolutely beautiful. We've got these standing snags that don't come up to the present, but they do overlap in time with the earliest years of these living trees. And so by matching the pattern of wide and narrow rings, you've suddenly gone from maybe 600, 700 years of living tree to 600 and 700 years of living tree plus another 400 to 500 or 600 years of standing snag, getting us back through the first millennium. And then the real prizes, the dead and down stuff, this gets us back actually to before the year 1 AD into BC. And again, how do we do that? We take the patterns of wide and narrow rings from here and we match it up against the part of the standing snag that was growing at the same time as this tree was dying. And now we've got a continuous record by piecing together the living, the standing dead, and the down and dead by matching perfectly the ups and downs, the wide and narrow rings that they have. A continuous chronology, and I'll show you how far back we go. There's the year 1 AD. We actually have new pieces that take us back 200 years before BC, before Christ. What are you looking at? What you're looking at is the reconstruction of this Polymer Drought Severity Index. So when these values are up, you have wetter conditions. When you have negative values, these are dry conditions. The black lines are the year-by-year estimate of that drought, and then the red line is showing you a smooth sort of 20-year version of that. And what should be obvious is there's a lot of variability here. There's times where it's dry, there's times where it's wet, there's good years and bad years, there's good decades and bad decades. I'm just going to zoom in only on the last 1,200 years because this is where we're asking our questions. So just to show you this section, and a few things might already jump out at you. Amy and I and some of our colleagues wrote a paper recently about the modern drought and how it compares, the recent drought, and how it compares to these older droughts. But what I want us to focus on for this story is this period right here, from the middle 1100s to the middle 1200s. So a nice sort of 100-year segment during which much interesting things happened in Mongolian history. So that Mongol Empire expansion I showed you, that map of, occurs right here in this period. And what we've seen is this period we call the Mongol pluvial. Now it's not incredibly wet, right? It's not that every year is a 2 or a 3. But what's remarkable and unique in this record, going back over 2,000 years now, it lasts 15, 16, 17 years. So basically over a decade of really nice conditions, really wet conditions on the steppe, right as Genghis Khan and his armies spread out to conquer Europe. This was interesting too. This is one of the worst droughts on record. There's only 2 other droughts that come close to this 1180s drought in severity and duration. And what we know about this time is this is actually a period of a lot of fragmentation, a lot of tension on the steppe, of groups, including Genghis Khan's group that eventually rose to dominate the rest of the group and bring them together. A lot of groups fighting, stealing from each other, raiding each other's encampments and cities. It was out of this fragmentation and chaos that Genghis Khan's group took control of the rest of these groups and eventually led them as a unified force, as an empire, out to conquer Europe. I said we can do maps of this, so this is a map of the same time period. Here's where we are in Mongolia. And what you see is this period is incredibly wet throughout most of Mongolia. This was good times to be a nomadic pastoralist on the steppe, and it was a really good time if you happen to have ambitions to conquer the known world. History has these really interesting contingencies, right? It could have been really wet, and the leader could have said, nah, stay home, things are good, right? And so it's not just climate. It's also climate enabled the ambitions of a really amazing military genius, Genghis Khan. So what we think happened is this. Really good conditions back home in the heartland of the Mongolian Empire allowed them to have tons of horses. So every Mongolian horseback archer, which is pretty badass, had 5 horses, right? They took 5 horses, and there were tens of thousands of them to ride all the way across the Asian steppes. Also what it meant was there was a lot of food back home. And it also meant that you could take most of your males, most of your fighting age males, because times were so good back on the steppe that there was plenty of food for the sheep and the cows. There was no real worry about sustaining your population back home. So we think that this this pluvial condition, this period of uninterrupted wetness, was what at least helped Genghis Khan go out and become one of the great empires of known history. So for the remainder of our time, I wanted to take us to another part of Asia. We're going to come down here to Southeast Asia, and this is the Khmer Empire. In this form, it comes about in 802 CE AD, and lasts until we think, or canonically, 1431 CE, when the city Angkor, which you've heard of probably, was sacked by the Siamese from Ayutthaya. At least this is how the story goes. This is the extent, at its maximum extent, of the Khmer Empire. They were surrounded by other civilizations and empires in Bagan, in Vietnam here, and of course the Chinese to the north as well. They may have been surrounded by other empires, but they were incredible. There's very good evidence that this was the largest city in the world in pre-industrial times. Bigger than pre-industrial London, bigger than any pre-industrial city in Asia or in Europe otherwise. I'll show you a map in a moment. Their city of Angkor, which means city in Sanskrit, covered an immense area, and the engineering of works are dazzling. What you're looking at here is called the West Barai. This is a reservoir. It has an island with a temple in the middle of it. And what's so amazing about this reservoir is you'd think, all right, if I have to build a reservoir, I'm going to go out and dig a hole and fill it with water. No. They pushed up the walls. So nowadays, if you want to get on one of these boats and go around the Barai, you actually have to climb up to the edge to be able to see into this huge reservoir. When this reservoir was active and when London existed, you could have fit all of London in this reservoir, to give you some idea of the contemporaneous scale. So here's a map. This is from Damien Evans. Worked for years and years mapping this from a mixture of air photos, on-the-ground surveys, and you'll recognize, many of you, Angkor Wat. So while the whole region is called Angkor, and we call it often Greater Angkor, most people are probably most familiar with the temple complex at Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is sort of in this downtown area. Angkor Thom right here is an even bigger enclosed area. Here's that West Barai I was showing you. It's matched on the east by the East Barai. And then the city just spreads out in all directions, right up into the edge of the Tonle Sap flood zone, which then flows into the Mekong River. You can zoom in on this map. Damien has my incredible admiration. The details in this map are amazing. So now we're looking at one corner of the East Barai, and you can see this water infrastructure that brings water into the Barai, and then there are ways to shuttle water out and down these canal systems. So a mixture of earthworks, dams, canals that moved water across this landscape. And it was really important to move water across this landscape for two reasons. One was irrigation. So you could provide water to these extensive, this is a modern one, but you could provide water to these extensive rice fields. If you have a population this big, you have a lot of mouths to feed, you have monumental architecture, you need to have a lot of rice to feed people. But even as big a problem as irrigating rice was making sure it didn't get flooded. So every year the monsoon would come and dump rains up here in the Kulin Hills, and that water would start to find its way down towards the lowlands at Tonle Sap. And so you've got a massive amount of monsoon water moving through your greatest city ever, and you have to manage that. You have to avoid flooding, you have to avoid killing the young rice, you have to avoid flooding out. And so canals were equally important for moving water off the landscape and away from agriculture and monumental architecture. So we were interested in knowing, well, was there any climate connection to the demise of Angkor? And this is actually a temple at Angkor. These trees, unfortunately, are not useful. These are figs. They don't put on really nice annual rings. They're actually pretty young, despite their look. But what we did discover in the highlands of central Vietnam was a really incredible species. This is Phocaenia hudgensii. It is the only species in Phocaenia, so it's a single genus in a genera. They get to be, as you can see, incredibly large. And we discovered a forest of these in the central highlands of Vietnam, kind of hemmed in by two rivers. And this area had actually been and continues to be protected. You can see the size of these trees, some of them a meter or more in diameter. Like sort of sequoia, you can get a bunch of people around and see if you can actually hug these. This is Lee Kam Nam, our collaborator there, coring one. This borer that he has is actually much bigger than this one, to give you some sense of scale. And often we weren't even able to reach the center of some of the older trees. These trees are, some of them living over 1,000 years old, so similar to some of the ones we found in Mongolia, but even older. So in 2010, we actually published a paper on this using those data from the Phokenia to reconstruct Drought. And then I'm showing you this in map form. These are, again, those maps of this atlas, this sort of year-by-year weather data from the 14th century and the 15th century. And what we noticed was that prior to the sack of Angkor in the 1430s, there were two extended, rather severe droughts. The worst we call Angkor I, which was in the middle of the 14th century. It lasted from 1345 to 1365. Looks like repeated monsoon failures. Year after year, the monsoon fails or comes late. Really one of the really driest periods we had in that record. And then in the earliest 1500s, a really severe drought I'll show you in a moment, from 1401 to 1425, and it's at least believed canonically that Angkor collapses in 1431. So we identified this, we talked about how climate might be a contributor to the demise of Angkor. This was with our archaeological colleagues Dan Penny and Roland Fletcher, in addition to our Thai and Vietnamese colleagues. Now, we've since come to complicate this story a bit, so let me walk you through what we're looking at. On the top, thanks to the work of our colleague Dan Penny, is an estimate of the water moving capacity and the water holding capacity of this city. So he, based on new technology, was able to take all these different canals, all these different reservoirs, and estimate what the maximum capacity, when all of those were functioning as they should, could be. And he could do that actually in units of meters cubed of water. What I'm showing you here is just the relative capacity. So at its height, it would have been 100%. By the time you're into the 1100s, the care and maintenance of this has already started to decline so that the system is only at 80% capacity. And you can see, of course, how it declines. Here is our drought reconstruction. What I've done now is showing you dry conditions in the red, and in the blue showing wet conditions. And so in that 2010 paper, what we focused on were these two droughts that we've called Angkor I and Angkor II, and we even at the time noticed this sort of brief period of really strong flooding. As we started to investigate this more, though, we've come to realize a few things. One is that these periods of flooding are actually also really interesting. They tend to be shorter, although not entirely. They tend to be more episodic and shorter. But this is an interesting occurrence, which is, and I'll show you some evidence of this, it appears that in the late 1100s, there was a period of very strong monsoons, and at the same time, there was a lot of damage accumulated in the water holding and moving capacity of this civilization. Later floods came along. They're shorter as well, but we think that we've come around to think that flooding is also important, and I'll show you in a moment why we believe that to be the case. There's also this drought, which is actually similar, perhaps a bit longer, than that drought we called Angkor I that we thought was so important in determining weather or determining the demise of Angkor. So why didn't Angkor collapse back here? Now, just out of curiosity, or just out of to mention, one of the things that makes this a mystery at Angkor, similar to the mystery of the Maya, similar to the mystery of what happened to the ancestral Pueblo, and similar to the lack of internal knowledge about how the Mongolians rose to power, the Mongol Empire rose to power, is that the last Sanskrit inscription at Angkor comes in the early 1300s. This period, therefore, of the final century and the demise of Angkor is uncovered by documents of what might have happened. So once again, we have this lacuna, we have this gap in our knowledge. interestingly, this seems to follow this sequence of a flood and a drought. We don't know if they're related, but we're starting to see at this point that the water holding capacity or the water maintenance or movement capacity of Greater Angkor is now fallen to a paltry 20%. Now, why do we think that flooding might have been important? Well, we've been doing some modeling of this, but I don't want to show you the modeling. I want to show you what we actually see on the ground. So this is a new data source. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called LiDAR. And what you can do is put this instrument on a helicopter or a fixed-wing plane, and you can fly it over, and you can get a 3D view of the landscape underneath. Even more impressive, you can divide it into layers, and so if your, say, giant city happens to be obscured partly under jungle, you can actually use the computer to peel back the jungle and look at the buildings that are underneath. Or say what you really want to do is understand these canals. You could peel back even the buildings and look just at those features that are related to these earthworks. It's amazing technology. It's really revolutionized how we come to understand some of these really extensive cities. So this is a LiDAR image, and I'm going to zoom in on this black box. But before I did, I wanted to give you an idea of where we are. So here is Angkor Wat. This is the moat surrounding Angkor Wat. There's Angkor Wat at the center. If you could come up here, one of the things that's crazy is there is evidence of very regular occupation, house mounds, people living inside the walls of this. So what was thought to be mostly ceremonial seems to have had actually people living in the walls. You can see it clearly in Angkor Thom. So when I say that we're going to look here, I'm basically describing being, near Times Square, being near the White House. Okay, we are in the center, the very center, the ceremonial and the political center of Angkor, right here. So let's zoom in on that. Here's what we see. What's going on here, what we know from comparison of the LiDAR image to actually on the ground image is you are seeing the result of at least one, probably two massive flooding events that completely busted up this canal and dam system. There's at least one breach here. There's another breach here. This one might have been intentional to try and take the pressure off the rest of the system. When this breach occurred, you can see a very close near breach and scouring throughout this canal system in both locations. This is actually the modern road right here. That's why it looks so regular. People drove up there. What we believe this is, what the archaeologists believe this is, Damien Evans and Dan Penny and their colleagues is, this is the result of a flood. A massive flood, probably either in here or in here. The dating's not exact. And it went unrepaired. There's no sign in the LiDAR, there's no sign in the field excavations that even though this central location, this really important downtown spot in Angkor was damaged, that no one ever repaired it. And this fits with this pattern of a progressively declining infrastructure. Slowly but surely, floods are happening, canals are silting up, no one's fixing anything, local politicians are not taking responsibility. Giant potholes. But what we think we're seeing here, right, is there's two things going on simultaneously. This is a city in decline. A once great city is no longer maintaining its infrastructure, the very infrastructure that allowed it to become the largest and one of the most sophisticated cities in the world before the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Things are getting bad. What we think is going on is that there was still enough water infrastructure back here, 50% or more capacity, to perhaps still maintain those barais with enough water to allow that water to be distributed to offset some of these drought effects, even though there had clearly been some damage from this early period of strong monsoons. By the time you get out here, this system is barely working, barely functioning. There's no way and no one to distribute this water to allow the effects of this drought to be buffered. And so it's not simply the climate that's causing or contributing to the demise of Angkor, it's the combination of two things. It's the climate on top of this decline in maintenance of the infrastructure, of the political will, of the control of the elites in this system. So originally when we wrote this paper, we said, okay, water management of these canals allowed places like Angkor, a city like Angkor, to sort of weather the storm, if you will, of a strong monsoon year or a weak monsoon year. You have the water infrastructure to divert extra water from a strong monsoon year and the ability to hold water and redistribute it through the bad times. And it was only when these sort of really long droughts came in the 1300s and the 1400s that this system that had been built for this interannual sort of year-to-year variability started to fail when you got decades-long droughts. That's what we said in 2010. We've come to question this a little bit. We've come to realize that decline in the water infrastructure was equally as important as the occurrence of these droughts. Droughts and floods had come and gone in the earlier history of Angkor, even as monumental architecture building had reached its height, even as the city extent had reached its maximum. It was only then when the infrastructure and the political or the ability of the elites to deliver water or deliver flood relief to people living there that ultimately Angkor felt its demise. Whether it was the Siamese that actually sacked the Siamese from Ayutthaya that actually sacked Angkor, or whether it was something perhaps less dramatic, perhaps linked to the failure of the political system and its ability to provision and move water, we don't know. We only think the Siamese sacked the city because people wrote about it later. But in fact, there's some uncertainty even about this. But this decline in infrastructure seems to be incredibly important. Now, before our Australian friends were the archaeologists at this site, the French were here before they had to leave Cambodia. Grosset wrote this talking about Angkor, this idea that Angkor was this hydraulic city that exploited its space admirably and adapted to this countryside of too much water or too little water. It was this infrastructure that allowed them to blossom, to become such a power and such a large city, and the triumph of their civilization. Even they realized in the 80s, though, that something became amiss. That it reached, evidently, at just 2/3 of the way through its history, a sort of blockage of itself. And now we know from LIDAR that that was a literal blockage of itself, the failure of this water infrastructure. And then finally, when these droughts and floods came at the end of its time, condemned it to, as he said, asphyxiation. So what I hope now that I've tried to explain over the last 45 minutes is that we can go back and reconstruct climate variability. We can see droughts and floods in the past, and we can use trees that were there standing on the landscape for millennia to get that information. They were witnesses to these climatic changes. They were witnesses to the rise and fall of these civilizations. But it's not just climate. We are not passive, as humans, recipients of what the climate has to throw at us. And this is a paper by the now late Carl Butzer, but Carl saw this very clearly, that there was a tendency to ascribe things strictly to climate. But what Carl said is, well before you arrive at a climate perturbation that could trigger collapse or could trigger instability, there's preconditions. And some of these we might recognize in the stories I've told today or in other instances. Elite corruption or incompetence, the inability to maintain infrastructure, rural insecurity, anthropogenic degradation, poverty. On top of these preconditions may come some kind of trigger like a climate perturbation, be it climate variability or climatic change. And then there's a moment of choice. Does the civilization have ways to buffer and prevent these conditions from getting worse and have an environmental resilience or social transformation that allows us or them to be adaptable and resilient? Or does a civilization follow this path of breakdown? Intra-institutional conflicts, polarization of the elites, the loss of authority, political simplification, dividing into two camps. And does this lead us into a period of instability and collapse? So while these are interesting stories in and of themselves, we're trying to understand now, using formal models, combining with historians and archaeologists, are there general lessons? Our cities are not like Angkor, our civilizations are not like the Mongol Empire, but are there more general lessons we can learn about how civilization and climate variability or climate change might interact to decide whether we follow a path, a path of adaptation or a path of instability? So with that, I want to thank all of you for being here. I wanted to call attention to a new project within the College of Science called the Climate Systems Center. It's headed up by Dr. Jess Tierney in the Geoscience Department. Our interest is, we're just getting started, but one of the things we want to do is support young scholars working on these questions of both climate variability, what we can learn from past climate, and what it means about establishing resilience, adaptation, and environmental justice and ethics going into the future. So if you have more questions about the projects we're coming up with or have an interest in supporting this, please do get in touch with one of us. And with that, I'll leave you with a picture from Angkor. And thanks again to the Tucson Botanical Gardens and especially to the College of Science for having me. And thanks to all of you for being here.
Just a few things. Clearly, we're going to get to the question and answer part. I do want to announce next month's talk. It will be on the first Thursday at 6 p.m. of each month. So March 7th, same bat channel. And and just last week we were here, right? But from here on out, it's the first Thursday.
It's not going to be cold anymore.
That's
so.
right. We'll see. Through May. And next month's talk is Monsoon Stories from the Sky Islands, another colleague from Laboratory of Touring Research. And then just the last push, there are pencils and evaluations back there. And then I'll just ask Kevin, for the sake of everyone in the room, I mean, we can hear each other pretty well, but maybe repeat the question if it's, or paraphrase it. Yeah, so go ahead with the question and answer.
You mentioned in.
Okay. Well, you said you're trying to think of how the current world, which is not mainly agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we depend on food, but like we're not like the nomads and stuff.
Yeah.
Have any theories come up about, like, for instance, the 20-year drought we're in the southwestern United States or anything like that, or how do you think the research has to change, like for scientists 200 years from now to figure out what happened with us?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we apply these lessons or this information from the past to thinking about present and sort of future, right? And have lessons emerged yet? That is still where we're trying to understand. Is there lessons that we can draw? Can we come up with a general theory that describes resilience versus susceptibility based on these civilizations that were still different from us? So one thing we're looking at is actually networks and interactions amongst different groups. So how much does the connections to both within a society and also from that society to other similar societies, neighbors, how does the presence of those connections or the severing of those connections make a group more or less resilient? You can see there's evidence of this in the Roman world. When you've got a lot of connections and you can draw on a lot of resources, you're more resilient than when those connections are broken and you're at the mercy of just what you can grow sort of locally. So how important are these regional and global networks? That's one place we're going with. So what we're trying to do is come up with sort of, is there a generalized theory of how complex civilizations and the characteristics of complex civilizations, whether they be a pre-industrial city like Angkor or another city like the Mayas and the civilization, is there some kind of general insight we can draw from when they were resilient and when they collapsed? I think one of the things we have to do is move away from just noticing collapses and focusing in on those. And I think what we're trying to do here in Angkor is see those times where they didn't collapse. In fact, in the face of droughts or floods, they were resilient and even ascended. Is there a lesson there in looking at the unexamined quadrant of climate change that didn't have a negative impact? What can we learn about the periods where things got better or didn't change, and what can we learn about the period where there was collapse, and can we make generalizable rules? So, but it's a challenge.
So are you working with political science or international relations too?
Yep, so we've got political science and we've got political scientists. We have people that work on trying to understand modeling the effects of sort of quantitative social science and modeling the effects of these different sort of connections between groups and things like that. So so we're having to expand our circle of usual collaborators to bring in the kind of expertise that we need. Thank you. Yeah.
Back to Genghis Khan, I was wondering if there's a biological explanation component here. And that is, during this great time of wonderful rain and all, you not only have an explosion of the population of horses and sheep and cattle, but of people. And as soon as you get that, with any species in a biological system that has a huge population growth, you have absolute dispersal tendencies going on. And it could have been, in his case, he was making the dispersal to the rest of the world, inhabiting new places. And that was kind of dovetailing on your tree ring evidence of drought and water.
Yeah. So the question is, in addition to lots of horses and sheep, you also probably have an increase in population. And I think that's almost certainly true. Whether that was a driver out to need more space, or whether also that may have allowed more fighting age males to be the ones to take their 5 horses and leave the younger generation at home because the pastoral life was easy. You know, some of this is lost. I mean, there are writings that mostly speak to people that wrote externally about the Mongol Empire, right? They weren't members of it, they were conquered by it. So some of the written records provide some information, but again, this is one of those things where we don't necessarily know the motivations or exactly what sort of went on in these times. But yeah, it was definitely probably a human population increase as well.
I guess what I found really interesting is, you know, in the historical record, I mean, it's almost like, is it more difficult to do the science, or is it more difficult to upend what people believe? I don't know, and that just was amazing. And then science, I guess, has to ask the same question over again. It's not even,
Yeah, so the question is it difficult to sort of upend what people have believed for a very long time in many cases? It's always difficult to upend what people have thought for a while. What's been amazing, I think, about the Mongol case was when Neil and Amy and me and our colleagues published this, people were really convinced that at least it was wet, right? It wasn't dry. The question then follows, though, is how important is the climate in how history proceeds? And there's a very strong pushback against seeing climate as necessarily important at all. So you do have people that see this as deterministic, that because it was wet, you're saying that the Mongols had to go out or would have gone out and conquered the known continent. We're trying not to say that at all. We're trying to be very careful not to say that these preconditions, this condition allowed this to happen. But again, if Genghis Khan was not the leader that he was, if his groups had not been able to unify the other warring factions, this might not have happened. So there is these contingencies in history that we have to be mindful of, and we have to be careful as climate scientists to not overstep our bounds in thinking that only our field is the relevant one. And hopefully what we've done is be careful to make sure that we're developing teams that include anthropologists, historians, local scientists in the country where we're working. So I think that's the most important thing for us. Thanks. Yeah, in the back.
So it's obviously pretty fascinating that you can like take the different pieces of tree ring and kind of line them up historically. So I was wondering what types of factors, whether it's like something environmentally, kind of hinders that process of lining up all the tree rings.
We've been incredibly fortunate at this site that the lava field is fairly well contained. They're all seeing the same kind of rainfall. They're all the same, have a very similar kind of climate response. So because they're all so moisture sensitive, locking that pattern in is actually pretty easy. Where it becomes a challenge is if you don't have enough overlap. So say you've got a period where you think you've made that connection, but it's only like 10 or 15 years. You got to be careful not to fool yourself. And so we try to bring in other sources of information. We can use radiocarbon to support matches like that. Occasionally, some of these trees are available in historical structures with their own knowledge, and so we can constrain that. And then the other thing that can be difficult is, as dendrochronologists, we tend to choose trees that look like they're stressed, that they're in a stressful environment because they are more likely to be recording those year-to-year variability, the year-to-year variability. If you're looking at, for instance, trees that people selected for construction and put in their fortresses or temples, the builders of those ancient buildings, we're not looking the same way Denver chronologists are, very inconveniently. So on one hand, you may have this difficulty in there's a really strong signal in trees that are very climate sensitive, but you may be trying to match up ancient wood from, especially from buildings, or that just happens to be laying around and you don't know the context it came from, that doesn't have that same kind of variability, that's more complacent. So that's often one of the challenges of doing this. And then there's really no way to know whether what you're sawing is going to fit into the chronology you have, or whether it's too old and you'll never lock it in. And then also finding this wood. We're very lucky at this lava field that it's still there, but if you actually go to the village side of the lava field, same lava field, but the side that's closest to the village, you can basically see a radius from the village out onto the lava field where people have gone out to gather wood, and there's no wood there at all. So over the past several decades, people burned potentially millennium-aged wood for fuel and had no idea, right? So yeah, so dead wood often doesn't stick around very long. Good question.
That sounds like a good movie.
Yeah.
It just reminds me in the Xinjiang province in China, there's also many wood that stand for a long time. I mean, even several hundred years, and we use that wood to trace what happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. Where is this?
In the Xinjiang province.
Yeah. So anywhere you can find places where, so the key to finding old wood that happens to be laying around, it needs to be far enough away or protected from people that they haven't come to take it to do something else with it. So the middle of a sort of jagged lava field turns out to be really good. Usually a fairly dry or cold climate. So in like a moist climate like the East Coast US or tropical regions, stuff decays so quickly that it doesn't lay around for very long. And then we've been very lucky here that even when stuff falls down, it tends to be perched up on these rocks. So it's not subject to the kind of insects and bacteria that want to break it down. So those are the most important things, finding places that people haven't taken the wood and finding places that decomposition has not taken the wood from. But yeah, you can definitely do that. Yeah.
Underwater logs increasingly being used. They seem to be well preserved, but maybe you can't tell where they came from.
Which is this? Sorry. What?
Underwater logs.
Oh yeah. So so the question is, can you use logs that have been submerged for a similar type of thing? And absolutely yes. So one of my students, actually one of my graduate students, has been working on cedar trees from swamps in New England. And when those swamps got flooded by the ocean, they got buried in mud and they're underwater, and so they've been preserved there. Some of them are as old as 5,000 years old in that context. In logging, places where, say, bald cypress was logged in the southeast and the logs were floated down the river, some of those logs got lost, and you can actually go and pull them up, and they can be preserved for thousands and thousands of years. And then my favorite story, one of my colleagues in Louisiana, there was a big storm that came up into the Gulf of Mexico. It scoured the bottom in this one location south of Alabama, and fishermen with their fish finders noticed something weird when they went over this site. Christine dove down with her team and found an old bald cypress forest hundreds of meters below water.
Wow.
So it must have been growing there back when there were large ice sheets and sea level fell far enough to allow a forest to establish. So those trees are still there, you can still see the trunk. Yeah. So water is another great way to preserve and keep stuff from breaking down. Yeah, that's a great question.
So the moral of the story is it's good that we have sea levels rising.
Yeah. Well, back then we feel positively about it, so yeah.
Maybe one more question? We have one?
Good.
If not, I'll take the question. Would you mind just telling us how you got into this field, and maybe what your big aspirations are?
Yeah, so I went to Georgetown actually to be a lawyer.
We got him.
That lasted a semester, and I decided I wanted to do something. I didn't really know what, but I'd always loved history, so that was the thing that taken me to Georgetown. And I went to a talk by a geographer named Tim Beach, and he worked in the Maya region of Yucatan, studying how climate and environments had changed, both due to natural variability and also how the Maya had manipulated their environment. They had created dams and terraces, modified wetlands. And so I got to go in the field with him to actually work at a Maya site in the Yucatan on an excavation. And I was hooked, and I was like, how can you figure out how this landscape changed in the past? And once I was asking myself that, I went to go find ways that you can answer those questions. So
Definitely looks like more fun.
Well, we're lucky to, oh, go ahead.
So you've got an awful lot of detail of a couple of these cultures
Mhm.
in geographic areas in Asia. Has somebody been working similarly for the Four Corners country, and what happened to the, more detail on what happened to the Anasazi and the old Pueblos?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got this climate information, got the early excavations, but archaeologists are still working on these questions, and they're increasingly bringing new sort of data, new finds about where people might have gone. They can do modeling, Asian-based modeling, so trying to understand how people might move across a landscape with a variable climate. So still trying to understand how much of people's departure from those sites was due to climate, or how much was due to cultural factors, where did they go, what happened when they got there. So this is definitely still an active area of research, and so the more information you accumulate, the more nuanced understanding you can come to of the sort of human factors, political, economic factors, and how those might or may not be related to climate. So yeah, that's still an active area of research. Not something I've done personally, but people here at U of A actually working on that. Yeah.
And I'll just mention the gardens are open till 8. Let's join again in thanking Kevin for a great talk.
This is so cool.